Hello, and welcome to this week's discussion about supplier selection criteria. This is part of your week 2 journal and milestone, in which you are asked to determine supplier selection criteria for your particular industry and company. In this discussion, we're going to be going over 3 main criteria: how to select a supplier, how to select a distributor, and how to consider third-party logistics. In general, there are 2 types of supplier relationships that we consider when dealing with selecting a supplier. The first type of relationship, called an arm's length relationship, is basically where a company procures parts and supplies using several suppliers and searches for the best price each time an order is placed. This usually has 2 or more suppliers that are approached with what we call a request for bid or a request for purchase. And then each of the individual suppliers would create a bid and try to provide the best price for that order. We also have what is called a strategic partnership, which is also called virtual integration. This is where all entities within the supply chain work together to leverage competitive advantage. This is called virtual integration because in many instances, all of the partners within the strategic partnership will form relationships throughout the supply chain without the need of contracts or similar vehicles. This provides a relationship that builds upon trust to leverage everyone's best interest within the supply chain. So the arm's length relationship has several advantages. First one is lower costs. If you're able to set up order frequencies such that you need parts or products within a certain time, and you're able to get the bids out timely and get the financing and funding taken care of quickly, you could lower costs in the short term by driving lower costs over time as each purchase occurs. This also provides flexibility because in many cases in which you have a lot of variability with what you need to purchase, you may order only what is required instead of being locked into an order quantity that you may not need. This is good for something like new products which may not have a very good forecasting history, or can be used for products which may have a very short-term lifespan. So you may not want to get into a long-term relationship with something that you're only going to purchase once or twice. You can also react to market conditions more quickly. Once again, if you have a very fast requisition system, you could put in an order quickly to take advantage of market conditions by ordering supplies when needed. Now, there are several disadvantages to this strategy, and these are disadvantages that pretty much describe why these are not used very often in large companies. First, you have less focus on the relationships and more focus on profitability. This creates a situation in which the purchaser is able to drive savings for themselves at the cost of the other party. So there's not much of a relationship involved because it's pretty much one way. There's less control over product quality. If you have a very short-term relationship, it is very difficult for you to understand the quality of the product without previous research or even from previous performance with other parts or other products. Therefore, you have less control over product quality because since you're not willing to lock into a long-term relationship with a large number of orders, the person that you're ordering the materials from may be less willing to have you have a say over the quality of the product. And once again, as I mentioned before, it creates a win-lose relationship where one entity wins at the expense of the other. This results in a high reliance on contracts to enforce agreements. Since the relationships are very short-term based on each purchase order, there's no desire for each party to try to do anything that will be worth longer than the purchase order length. This is especially true with things like quality, in which if you need to change a part or a product and you basically order it one at a time, forcing a bid proposal, each of the parties will pretty much only give you what you bid. And since there's no relationship, they won't be willing to better understand what you require. So there are some win-lose in this strategy. But for those companies who have a short-term need in a very short market or have a system in which they can fulfill orders in a very fast manner, arm's length relationship can be something that can be considered. Now, strategic partnerships have several advantages. The first one is they have higher collaboration. Basically, what this means is every party within a strategic partnership learns about each other over time. So they begin to develop these informal agreements such that they begin to understand and trust each of the other members. And they're also more willing to work towards the best interests of the entire supply chain. Basically, since we have a relationship across the supply chain, it's more of a win-win situation where one party may be more than willing to sacrifice a short-term win so that they can get a long-term win across the supply chain in the future. Now, this also creates increased vertical integration. Like I mentioned earlier, it develops this virtual integration scenario where everyone begins to know about each other and they begin to help each other throughout the supply chain. This results in entities being better positioned to assist others within the supply chain. And of course, you get better information sharing due to increased trust. As you're going to find out later in this class, some of the contracts that you create will develop a scenario in which information sharing would be beneficial across everyone, especially when you deal with things like the bullwhip effect, which we will cover in later weeks. But since there is increased trust within a strategic partnership, they'll be more willing to share their data with other partners because they are more likely to feel that they're not going to be taken advantage of. Well, this is a complete different contrast to the arm's length relationship in which, in many cases, the companies will hold their data close to the vest because they feel that the other party may use that data to get a better deal later in the future. It can easily happen that, although there are laws against it, where companies can take data gathered from another company to provide to another company to make their performance better to get a lower price. Now, this is rare, but it does occur. And this is a main reason why people don't really have a lot of trust in an arm's length relationship, because you don't have any control over information that you share. Now, the disadvantages of a strategic partnership is that you have a higher short-term cost in an arm's length relationship because in general you may be locked into purchases that may be more costly in the short term because you're not able to bid for lower prices across each of the different purchases. Now, one of the benefits though is that you can have a long-term cost that is usually lower than an arm's length relationship because you begin to take advantage of each other's strengths within the supply chain. Due to the relationship within a strategic partnership, each of the partners inside a strategic partnership will begin to understand how to leverage each partner's strengths to benefit the supply chain as a whole. This is why many larger companies like to use a strategic partnership. Although it does require a long-term outlook, if a company is comfortable with that, then this can be beneficial in the long term. This is especially true of products and services that have a long shelf life. So factors to consider when you look at a arm's length relationship by a strategic partnership is part or product criticality. So in many cases, you could have a company that has a mixture of the two. You may have some relationships for less critical items or for items that you only have to purchase once that may be pushed to an arm's length relationship because you're not worried about purchasing many. In some cases, you may see this arm's length relationship occur with someone that the company has had a relationship in the past, so that helps to leverage some of these advantages of a strategic partnership into an arm's length relationship. Now, product life cycle. If you have a product as a low life cycle, you may want to use an arm's length relationship due to the fact that things keep changing. You may have a product A for 6 months, then you have to do product B. Now, once again, this requires a very flexible requisition system. But if you have a good requisition system that's able to push requirements to suppliers, then you may be able to use an arm's length relationship for one-off items that may have a low life. In my experience, if you have several low life products in a life cycle chain, then it may be better to use a strategic partnership so that when the product changes in every evolution, your partners would be better able to understand the design and what is required for that product. Now, for new product entries, an arm's length relationship can be used for new products with uncertain demand. So if you want to reduce the costs associated with entering a new product that has a very uncertain demand, you may do a one-time buy with the lowest price possible, then see what happens, and then maybe go into a strategic partnership later. There are caveats to this. I'm not going to go over this within this video because it's outside the scope of this. We will discuss these things in more detail during the class, but just realize that sometimes new products with an uncertain demand can benefit from an arm's length relationship depending on the amount of risk involved. And as I said here, you can move to a strategic partnership later. If you go to an arm's length relationship and the company performs very well, there's no reason why you can't move to a strategic partnership with that provider later on. And this is very common in like engineering companies where you may push requirements to several companies and you may select one early on. You'll let them build products for a while, then you see how they perform. Then if they do very well, you move to a strategic partnership later. So attributes to consider for a supplier and for the relationship is, first thing, the supplier quality. Has the supplier shown the ability to maintain quality? This is true over small lots or large lots. And quality can be very subjective, but things you can do is look at previous quality from other entities within your organization. Have other people ordered items from this company? If so, then how is the quality? You can also look at cost trends. In general, high quality organizations are able to maintain the same level of quality regardless of the amount of products that are made. And in many cases, low quality organizations have higher costs. If you have a company that's able to maintain a low cost with a reliable quality over several levels of demand, that's a good sign that the company may have high quality standards. Ideally, you would go in there and do a quality audit, but if you don't have that capability, you could do some of these things to get a general estimate of the level of quality within that organization. Supplier capacity. Has the supplier shown the capability to take on new orders? This is very true of an arm's length relationship because in many cases, when you submit a requisition to a company to request materials or products, the company will try to fill that sudden demand from existing capacity. So once again, you can look at historical data to see how the company has performed over time. If they have shown an ability to absorb sudden increases in demand while maintaining the same level of quality and the same lead time and purchase price, then it's a good indicator that they have a very flexible capacity rate. So also prior performance. Has the supplier performed in other contracts within the company or with partners? Can you see how they've performed in other contracts? If the performance is solid and this is very important, and the characteristics of the contract are very similar to what you're going to be pursuing, then this is an indicator that they may be able to repeat that performance with you. Now, obviously, this would be taken within conjunction of the other two bullets and the fourth bullet, obviously, that I'm going to cover in a minute. So these all work together to help you understand the supplier performance. So information sharing. When you provide information to the company, are they able to respond in a timely manner? This is usually, in my experience, a very good sign of efficiencies within the company. If the company takes a while to respond to requests for information, or it takes a long time to get the purchase order, or it takes a long time for them to provide a bid, then that shows that maybe they have some issues within the company that may become visible as they begin to make products for you. Now, there are several other attributes, but these are like 4 of the main ones that I look at when I deal with suppliers. So, distributors. When you look at a distributor, there are 2 types of strategies that we look at. One is a direct shipment strategy. And a direct shipment strategy is you basically deliver from point A to point B in the fastest time possible with no intermediaries. The intermediate inventory storage strategy uses several nodes to work as either inventory control points or as transfer points using things like cross-docking, which we will cover more detail later in the class, to move inventory more flexibly across multiple end users or retail stores. So a direct shipment, as I mentioned, is a strategy where products are distributed directly between a supplier and retail store or an end user. So there are several advantages of this. The first one is low costs. If you're able to use a direct shipment, you're able to avoid additional expenses of operating additional distribution centers and the overhead of a warehouse and inventory within these distribution centers. You also have reduced lead times because you don't have to worry about your products going to a distribution center, being taken off a truck or transferred to a truck. Instead, you just go straight from point A to point B. This is a very important with perishable goods. If you have perishable goods like groceries or even pharmaceuticals that have a very short shelf life, you may want to use a direct shipment approach. Now, once again, you may see a combination of direct shipment and intermediate distribution. But in general, if you have perishable goods or items that require a very reduced lead time, like for instance, sometimes you may have a contract where you're required to produce a product within 24 hours or within 12 hours, in which case you may want to consider a direct shipment approach either in conjunction with your other strategies or specifically for this scenario. Now, there are different disadvantages. The first one is you negate the ability to use risk pooling due to centralized warehouse. So I will cover this in more detail later in the class, but what risk pooling does, it's the ability to aggregate the risks across multiple nodes, which in turn reduce the cost of safety stock. And we do this by staging inventory throughout the distribution system so that the demand across multiple areas can be absorbed by one location. It's a very quick definition. I will go through this in more detail. If you need more information on this, I have a video in my YouTube channel that provides a lot of good information on how risk pooling works. So second, there's increased manufacturer and distributor transportation costs due to additional shipments with smaller vehicles. And this is important because you are going from point A to point B. Point B may only have, let's say 20 units of demand. Whereas if you have 4 or 5 with 20, you could have a larger shipment with 100 units going to a certain central warehouse and then splitting those into smaller trucks. When you use a direct shipment strategy, you have to use the size of the shipment that is required for that retail outlet or end user. So therefore, you can have increased manufacturer and distributor transportation costs. And once again, you have reduced flexibility. If you're going from point A to point B and then suddenly point C requires materials, you don't have a way to stage materials or parts or products without going directly to the point C. So you reduce the flexibility by going to a direct shipment strategy. An intermediate inventory storage strategy is a strategy in which multiple distribution nodes are used to allocate inventory throughout the supply chain before distribution to a store or end user. Now, there are several advantages to this. The first one, you have increased supply chain flexibility. As I mentioned before, you could put a station point between, say, point A and point B that can be used to service, say, point C and point D, which allows you to aggregate demand in one location for multiple locations. As a result, you can reduce the safety stock required across all of your different end users through risk pooling, which I mentioned earlier, which is basically the aggregating of inventory at certain locations across multiple locations to reduce the amount of safety stock that's required. Once again, if you want more information, please refer to my YouTube video. And the third one, transportation costs can be reduced depending on the node design. Once again, we can use larger shipments to a central location. We can break off those shipments to smaller locations using smaller trucks. Now, once again, as you get less points on the node, the transportation cost benefit will decrease. Basically, what I mean by that is if you go to a node with 7 retail stores would benefit more than a node with, say, 4 retail stores on it because you're able to aggregate more inventory at that central node to be split off to each of the different end users. Now, there are disadvantages this strategy. The first disadvantage is increased lead time. You have increased lead time because every time the products go through a warehouse or distribution center, you have to take the time to move the product within that location. Now, there are things called cross-docking in which a truck shows up and then more products is put in a truck to pretty much move products without holding inventory at a node. Walmart is very good at cross-docking. Once again, I will cover this in more detail in the class as we move forward. But just realize that cross-docking can be used, not always, but sometimes can be used to decrease lead time in an intermediate inventory storage strategy. Now, the main disadvantage that we have also is that you have increased cost to maintain additional distribution nodes. This is sometimes why companies will go to a distributor who specializes in this, so that the cost to the company themselves is decreased while using the competitive advantage of a distributor, especially a distributor who may have a competitive advantage in the industry that they are working in. And also, increased complexity can bring about increased inefficiencies. And what this means is as you increase the complexity of your distribution system, there is a chance that you may have certain parts of the node not work. Like for instance, let's say if you have 2 warehouses that feed 15 locations, if one of the warehouses suddenly breaks down, well, all of a sudden the inefficiency will increase because now you are not as able to move the products to those locations at that specific warehouse provides products to. So once again, the increased complexity can bring about increased inefficiencies because each of the elements within an intermediate inventory storage strategy can suddenly have problems. Now, conversely, the increased complexity can increase efficiency as well. So if, for instance, you have the same scenario where you have 2 warehouses serving 15 locations, let's say that the snow hits one of the nodes and it suddenly shuts down, you will be able to reroute to the other nodes to get the product around with additional lead time, but at least you won't be completely shut down. Whereas an A to B strategy, if, say, snow knocks out the road, you're done. If you have an intermediate inventory storage strategy, this complexity can allow you to actually reroute products around the network, the distribution network, in order to bypass any issues with transportation. So this increased complexity, although it can cause increased inefficiencies, can also be used to mitigate problems within a distribution system. So a direct or intermediate distribution strategy. I see many students that feel, oh, well, sounds like an intermediate distribution strategy should always be used. Well, that's not always the case. There are certain scenarios in which a direct distribution strategy may be better than an intermediate distribution strategy. So for instance, customer demand and location. If you have one customer that has a very solid demand that does not vary very much, or you may have a contract where you provide so much over time, a direct distribution strategy may be a good way to go because there's very little variation. Conversely, if you have diverse types of demand and demand locations, an intermediate distribution strategy may be better because you're able to move products more freely between locations. Now, service level. Supply chains with high safety stock may benefit from an intermediate distribution strategy. This is through what I mentioned earlier, risk pooling, in which you're able to reduce the safety stock across an area by pooling it in one location to service multiple locations. So if you have a very high service level, basically service level is the amount of people that you are required to have products ready for. So let's say your service level is 98%, basically say 98% of people who buy your product must be able to purchase a product. That's usually about 95 is what people aim for, but 98% is pretty high. So if you have a very high service level, you may want to use an intermediate distribution strategy if there's multiple locations. If you have a high service level for one customer, and once again you have the very reliable demand, you may want to use a direct distribution strategy. Although once again, realize that with a 98% service level, if you have a service outage in that direct distribution strategy, you may want to consider having additional nodes in which you can be able to provide for that 98% service level. Now, lead time. Once again, supply chains with perishable items or items requiring intermediate delivery may want to do a direct distribution strategy because time is of the essence. You may not want to move things across a warehouse very quickly. This is true in my experience. I've seen this recently with pharmaceuticals where you may have drugs that have a very short shelf life. So you want to get it there quickly. But even then, sometimes you have a mixture of a direct and intermediate distribution strategy for these. Just depends. So in general, if you have perishable items or items that require a very short lead time, you may want to look at a direct distribution strategy. Transportation and inventory costs. Obviously, when you have A to B, you have smaller shipments because you can only ship as much as the retail outlet or end user of a direct distribution strategy will be able to sell. If you give them more, that's increased inventory, then they have to worry about storing it, obviously. Well, if you have multiple end users, if one person has a high demand, another one may have low demand. So you're able to offset the demand fluctuations using an intermediate distribution strategy to provide larger shipments to a node and then the smaller shipments much closer to the retail outlet. Now, demand variability. If you have high demand variability with increased service levels, you may require more safety stock. So as a result, you may want to look at intermediate distribution strategies which provides inventory pooling strategies that can be used to mitigate the demand variability across multiple locations. Now, third-party logistics. A definition of a third-party logistics is an enterprise that provides logistics services such as warehousing, order management, distribution, and transportation using their own assets and resources. These have become much more popular recently, especially for companies who are either startups and don't have the infrastructure and capability to provide their own logistics, or for companies that are large but may want to enter a new market. So, like for instance, in the company that I've worked with in the past, they would enter a new country, and the first thing that they would do is look for logistics capability. And if they can find a third-party logistics provider, then they would be more aggressive into going into this country to provide services. If the third-party logistics is not very robust there, or if the logistics in general is very weak, then they may consider either postponing it or not going in at all. So it just depends. So a third-party logistics is a very good option for companies who either want to enter a new market and don't want to risk building this logistics structure, or for companies who are small, who don't have a logistics structure, but yet need a logistics structure in order to provide their products to customers. So services provided are usually like inbound, outbound transportation, cross-docking, which I mentioned briefly before, which is seamlessly moving shipment through a network. So in cross-docking, the main fundamental attribute of a cross-docking approach is when a truck hits a warehouse, the product does not stay at the warehouse. So there's no inventory hold at a cross-dock. That's the key thing. So there are many 3PLs that are very good at cross-docking, where they have a good information network where they can understand how they can keep inventory from staying in one location. As a result, they can drive inventory costs at those locations very low because you're not keeping inventory there. They can also provide warehousing, freight consolidation, and distribution. In my previous position in Dubai, warehousing, freight consolidation, and distribution was a very important part of the distributors in Dubai because all the items went there, either arrived from Europe and went to the east to go to Europe. So their main focus was on getting the inventory, warehousing it. Dubai has a lot of space, consolidating the freight to locations where it needs to go, and then distributing the freight wherever it needs to go. That's why Dubai ports is very big, because they become very good at those three items. Okay, the advantages of a 3PL. In general, 3PLs are better able to update their equipment due to their competitive advantage. If they need to improve their ability to provide logistics, they're better able to build upon their existing infrastructure than a company that may have a very weak or no infrastructure at all. So this allows them to focus on their core competency while allowing the companies who may not have a good logistics structure to focus on their core competency. This is where the relationship comes in very handy. They can be more cost effective. Once again, 3PLs are very good at moving products to various locations, and they're good at providing information and tracking these products. So they could be much better at it than another company who is. So therefore, they may be more able to be they may be more cost effective than a company who may not be as experienced in providing the same services. And they also have greater flexibility because in general, 3PLs can provide and allocate additional resources more flexibly than their customer. And they're better able to consolidate low volume shipping through economies of scale. Once again, with my Dubai ports example, if you have a lot of small shipments and you're able to consolidate them very well, warehouse and freight forward it, you're able to take advantage of your large volume shipping by consolidating low volume shipping to various locations. So the disadvantages of 3PLs is, well, the first one, the 3PLs, their performance is relationship dependent. A 3PL works best when they're able to understand how a company works inside so they can leverage a company's advantages. And this sometimes leads to issues because a 3PL, some companies may not trust a 3PL to act fairly. So as a result, some of the information a 3PL may require to optimize their efficiency will not be available to them. And that's a risk. So short-term costs may be more than the company takes on the role themselves. So in some cases, a 3PL may have higher short-term costs. So in this case, the 3PL may have higher short-term costs for setting up the logistics system because they have a smaller order fulfillment activities in relationship to the company. Now, as the relationship gets stronger, they take on more fulfillment orders and are able to leverage more of their company. So as a result, the fixed costs are absorbed over more orders, if that makes sense. I hope it does. And then potential increased risk from variability within the supply chain. Because you require a relationship to understand how the company is able to perform in a relationship with a 3PL, the outside logistics function may not be as plugged into the company's needs. So they may not be able to forecast any issues with the company, which in turn may increase costs because they're not able to forecast or understand any of these issues before they occur. The risk decreases with increased 3PL integration within company operations. So if company operations has an issue and they're able to understand that this issue is going to occur, they can best proactively move their operations to mitigate this problem. Whereas if there's no relationship involved, they may not be able to understand the problem or even see the problem coming before they suddenly have this problem on their hands, which in turn will increase costs to mitigate the problem. So when looking at a 3PL, the main thing that you want to look at is the core competencies. Does the 3PL provide an advantage in a role that your company is lacking? You also want to look at whether or not the 3PL is familiar with your industry's particular requirements. That's why, in my experience, there are companies that do pharmaceutical 3PL. They're very good at understanding what a pharmaceutical company requires. Once again, fast lead times. Companies that may do, like for instance, I work with one right now that has a 3PL with aircraft engines. A company that is able to provide an advantage in shipping aircraft engines may not be the same type of company that you may want to ship pharmaceuticals around because the product characteristics are different and the requirements for the product and the customer are much different. And long-term comfortability. Once again, a 3PL, it works best when you have a long-term relationship with them so that they're able to adapt to how your company does business and engage with your information system and become like an extended arm for your company. And this is important because in many cases it requires information cost sharing that many companies are not comfortable with. So if you're that kind of company that likes to keep 3PLs at an arm's length, you may not want to enter into this type of relationship, at least in the long term, because you won't be able to leverage the strength of the 3PL most efficiently. So these are three quick things that I just discussed that are part of your journal and your personal assignment that's required in week 9. Here are the references that I use for this. The first reference, building lean supply chains with 3 up constraints, I use this quite a bit for understanding lean supply chains. If you like lean supply chains and understanding how lean supply chains work, this is one of the books that I really like. There's another book that I will introduce later in the class that's also very good with this. I don't have it here. It's called Supply Chain Science. If you are interested in getting it, please let me know in the class and I will get you the name of it and how to order it. It's very math intensive and it has a lot of stuff like that in it, but it's a very good book to have if you have a chance. And then Simchi Levy, Kamensky, their book, Designing and Managing the Supply Chain. It's an older book. We used to use this book in this class previously. Although some of the information in the book is outdated, many of the concepts in this book are still used and it's still valuable to anyone who wants to understand some of the core concepts that the current textbook either ignores or doesn't really go into long detail. Please feel free to leave a comment in the class if I can provide any more information, or if you see this on YouTube and you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment in the YouTube channel and I will, as soon as I see it, I will provide additional information as required. Thank you very much for watching.